Welcome to Goobertown Hobbies. My name is Brent. Today's video is for people who just need a little nudge to give mini painting a try. This is a tutorial for beginners. All you need is a brush, some paints, and something to paint. We're going to use multi-pack brushes and craft paint. This stuff is cheap and it's available almost everywhere. Mini painting doesn't need to be expensive or intimidating. Now, of course, purpose-made miniature paints are better, and if you get serious about this hobby, then they're a great investment. But you can have a great time even if all you have is $10 worth of craft paint. Today's video is sponsored by FartQuest, so we're going to be painting Bartok, Pan, Moxie, and TikTok. These characters are a party of adventuring heroes. They're a great introduction to fantasy books and RPGs. And now, I'm going to use them to show you how to paint miniatures. This tutorial can be applied to anything that you want to paint. Figurines, minis from board games, toys, really anything that strikes your fancy. I have a bunch of tips to get you started out right. My first tip is to get started. Let's put some paint on our brush and start painting. If you can make it this far, everything else is easy. The first step is always the hardest. I'm painting quick and sloppy right now, and I'm having fun. I'm also leaving some room for improvement. I've got a couple more models of Bartok, and on the next one, I'm gonna show you how to make him look smooth and clean. Right now, the only fancy thing that I'm doing is that I'm using a painting handle. I stuck Fart on top of a piece of wood to make it easier for me to hold him while I'm painting. It's not necessary, but it helps me to film, and it reduces the chances of us sticking our fingers in wet paint. If you want to give this a try, you can use poster putty or double-sided tape to stick your mini to a pill bottle, small jar, or piece of wood. Okay, dotting the I's real quick, and here we go. Fart is painted. That's all it takes to paint a mini. Your first painted mini is a real accomplishment, no matter what it looks like. Now, we're gonna do this again, and I'm gonna show you the basics to make the next paint job better. This time around, I'm brushing on a layer of primer. Primer is a durable all-over coat that gives the next layer of paint a better surface to stick to. The minis I'm working on today already have a pretty good texture for painting, so they don't really need primer, but for a lot of materials, it really does help. Priming is a good habit to get into. You can use any color of primer that you want. Black isn't necessarily the best color of primer, but it is traditional, and it's a fine place to start. If you're repainting a toy or something that already has some colors, it can be nice to start with a fresh canvas. Today I'm using brush-on primer, but spray cans are another good option. Once the primer is dry, it's time to start painting. On that first model, the paint ended up kinda chunky and uneven. That's often what happens when you try to work with one thick coat of paint. This time around, we're gonna do a couple of thin coats instead. So here's a paintbrush. A typical cheap synthetic brush straight from a multi-pack. It looks like it has a decent point on it, so this will work great. You can use whatever size brush you're comfortable with. I like to start with a big brush for the main colors and switch to smaller brushes later on. Now I'm gonna call this paper plate a paint palette, and I'm gonna put some paint on there. It starts out as a globby blob. Let's use some water to thin it down. I'm gonna dip my brush in my cup of paint water, and then I'm gonna use it to pull some paint out from the blob. We'll keep adding a little bit of water until we get something that flows better and doesn't leave behind any chunks. This is the first step to getting nice smooth paint jobs. Let's load up our brush and start painting. There's a lot of paint in the belly of the brush, but we haven't dunked it up to the metal ferrule. We want the brush wet, but it shouldn't be dripping. If there are visible drips, then you can dab the brush on a piece of paper towel. Now let's put this thin paint onto our model. Don't stress about making mistakes. It's only paint. You can always come back and paint over any errors. If we were using a thick paint, we might have to worry about building up weird textures that would obscure some of the details on the mini. But since we're using thin paint, we can use as many layers as we want. I often start paint jobs with the skin. Sometimes skin is a bit hard to get at with the brush, like around the neck and under the chin. Any skin tone that winds up on the clothes is gonna get painted over anyway. If you paint the hard-to-reach areas early on, then you don't need to worry about making mistakes. All paint is a bit translucent, so no matter what we do, we're gonna see some of the base coat underneath. There's no way to mash the paint around enough to get good coverage with a single coat. The best approach is to use 2 or more coats to build up to a solid color. We're using a few strokes of the paintbrush to put the paint where we want it. Then, we're gonna stop touching it and let it dry. Back to a shot of that first Bartok model. Even thick paint doesn't give full coverage in a single coat, and brushing it around more doesn't change that. These acrylic paints start to dry pretty fast, and brushing the paint while a film is starting to dry will just make a mess. A good strategy is to put on a thin coat of paint and then to leave it alone and let it dry. Get it on there and then stop touching it. That first thin coat of paint is gonna look a bit splotchy, and you'll see primer color poking through. That actually means you're doing it right. Most paint jobs go through an ugly phase where you just need to have faith. Trust the process and keep on going. Now is a great time to wash your brush. Dip your brush in your cup of water and wipe it on a paper towel. Wipe the brush in one direction like this to avoid bending the bristles. If you give it a little bit of a twist, you can help the bristles stay together in a nice point. Rinse and repeat until you've gotten all the water out of the brush. Paint drying on your brush will wear it out faster than anything else. It's good to wash your brush like this every few minutes, whether you need to change colors or not. If you're taking a little break from painting, wash your brush, give it a few extra swipes on the paper towel, and leave it flat on the table to dry. If you store it upside down, dirty paint water may run up into the ferrule of the brush and harden there, causing the bristles to split. Okay, back to painting. You can paint another color while you're waiting for the previous one to dry. The dry time really isn't too bad, normally about 15 minutes or so. In the meantime, there's a lot to keep you busy. Picking colors is one of the most fun parts of mini painting, and it also has a huge impact on how the final mini ends up looking. Inspiration for color schemes can come from almost anywhere. For Bartok, aka Fart, I like his look from the first book cover. He's an apprentice mage in brilliant blue robes. For Moxie the Dwarven Warrior, I'm taking her ginger hair from the newest book, Fart Quest and the Dragon's Dookie. I think green clothes look awesome with red hair, so I'm dressing her in green, more like the cover from book 1. And for Pan the Elven Monk, well, I just felt like using pink and purple. I don't think this really fits her personality, but hopefully it'll look cool. TikTok here is not a frog, he's a fibbling. He's a tinkerer, inventor, and artificer. In the books he has blue skin, but I had this apple tart green here that I wanted to try, so that's what we're doing. This is what a mini looks like after one coat of paint. There's a lot of black primer showing through, and the colors aren't solid yet. This is totally normal. We're gonna add another thin layer of paint right over the first one. Each layer is translucent, but they're going to add up to something solid. All minis go through an ugly stage, but if you stick with it, you'll wind up with a cool mini on the other side. By the time you get to doing a second coat of paint, the paint on your palette might be getting dry and wonky. Even if you add more water, it might not be quite right. It's time to retire that blob of paint. Treat yourself to a couple of fresh drops from the bottle, thin it out, and get back to work. Every paint and every color behave differently. Some colors are going to look great after a second coat, but some might take 3 or even 4 coats. If you decide to start investing money in this hobby, I suggest buying some real miniature paints. Miniature paints have more pigment, they're easier to work with, and you can normally get away with fewer coats of paint. The reason I'm using craft paints today is to make a point that anyone with a rainy afternoon can give this hobby a try. The barrier to entry is much lower than you think it is. Now some colors are a little bit tricky no matter what brand of paint you're using. This yellow-green on Moxie's cloak doesn't have very good coverage. It's going to take about 4 layers before we can get it nice and solid. Even with expensive paints, it would still probably take 3 layers for that shade of green on top of black. Sometimes the black undercoat looks good, and sometimes it works against us. This is why some people choose to prime with white or tan or whatever the main color of the mini is gonna be. On Moxie's hair, I'm using a bit of strategy. Yellow and orange are notorious for having bad coverage, but I want her to be a ginger. I started by painting her hair brown, and then I layered on the orange. Brown showing through underneath orange looks a lot more natural than black underneath orange. For Pan, I painted her all over with purple. Then I picked a few details to change to violet, and a few to change to pink. These related colors all play nicely with each other. Every mini is a little bit different. These Fart Quest minis aren't cluttered with a lot of detail, just smooth, clean curves. That's why I'm spending so much time trying to get smooth, clean coats of paint. Dice Heads is the design studio that made these minis. Dice Heads minis all have this great cartoony look. This 3D sculpting studio is a wonderful match for the illustrations that Cam Kendall does for the FartQuest books. The minis I'm working on are 3D printed, so at least for now, if you want these minis, you need to find somebody with a 3D printer. I'll put the information about how to get the STL files in the description of this video. Hey, they even have busts of the main characters. Okay, we're almost out of the ugly phase. Most of the colors are on the models. Now we just need to paint the details. The most important details are the eyes. Eyes aren't really white. Nothing is really white, so I used vanilla. Vanilla is the same color that I used for the teeth. On smaller eyes, I would dot them with black, but these eyes are big enough that we can give the irises some color. I picked a fresh, tiny brush from the multipack, extra pointy for detail work. More tips and tricks. For accuracy, it helps to brace your hands together. Lots of people paint with their elbows on the table and the heels of their palms pressed together. This reduces the amount of shaking and gives you a better chance at painting those tiny details. There are lots of variants of this. Sometimes I like to sit back in my chair, press my hands together, and brace my elbows on my rib cage. Make sure you're sitting in a comfy chair and that you have lots of light. It also helps to take care of your body. Try to get enough sleep and don't drink too much caffeine. That'll give you a bit better control with your paintbrush. Okay, let's see if I can paint these eyes. After the vanilla white, I'm making a big colored circle for the iris. Eyes are oval, but your irises are round, so there should be more vanilla white to the sides of the iris than above and below. After the iris, let's try to put the pupil in the center. Careful, careful. If we make a mistake, we can always just paint over it, but I'm trying to get it right the first time. And look! These minis are past the ugly phase. These are looking nice. Sometimes it sneaks up on ya. They look gnarly right up until they don't. Now, let's paint some metal. Metallic paints are different from normal colors. Silver paint is essentially gray plus glitter dust, and gold is yellow plus glitter dust. Well, technically mica dust. Anyway, metallic paints can look great, but they can also be a bit chunky and tricky to use. Undercoating with the right colors is a big help for metallics. Black is a good undercoat for steel and silver, and brown is a good undercoat for gold and copper. Again, I'm diluting these with water and putting down a nice thin coat. There's not a lot of metal on these models, but what little there is looking pretty good. Oh, and let's not forget to give our fibbling a few spots. A fibbling has gotta have spots. Now these models are looking pretty nice. We've gotten everything colored in with reasonably smooth coats of paint. From here, we could call them done, or we could take them further with a whole bunch of different techniques. Texture, shading, highlighting, freehand. This hobby can be as deep as you want to make it. For these characters, there's just one more step that I want to take. I want to do a bit of black lining. The books are cram-packed with black and white illustrations, and all the characters are defined by nice black lines. What I want to do is use my small brush and black paint to add some lines between the major blocks of color on these models. Some of the borders between shapes just seem like they need more definition. On Pan, a lot of the folds in her gi seemed like they were crying out for some black lines. I think this makes the 3D model look a bit more like the 2D art that inspired it. On Moxie, there are some borders between her hair and her clothing that I thought would really benefit with some black lines. As a final detail, let's give everybody some eyeliner. I don't understand makeup, but eyeliner looks cool. I went through for each character and cleaned up a few errors. It's only paint. You can fiddle with things as much as you want. Now let's declare victory. These models are done. Alright, so we used cheap paint and cheap brushes to put down some reasonably smooth coats of paint. We dotted the eyes, and then we traced some shapes with black paint. You don't have to be an artist to do any of this stuff. You just have to dive on in and paint bravely. The models are doing most of the work. We're just coloring them in and having fun. I'm happy to say that our second attempt at Bartok was better than the first one. I'm going to call the first one Fart and the second one Bartok the Brilliant. If you want to really get into this hobby, I recommend investing in real mini paints. As for the brushes, these cheap synthetics are still what I use for the vast majority of my painting. I hope this video is going to be useful for folks who are curious about this hobby. I love it when new people give mini painting a try. So please, share this video with anyone who you think might be interested. Also, if you know someone who might be interested in Bartok, Pan, Moxie, and TikTok, well, the third book just came out. Aaron Reynolds is the author of Fart Quest, and he's one of us. He loves mini painting and role-playing games. The books are a gateway for goobers age 8 to 12, but you're never too old for this stuff. Thanks again to Fart Quest and the Dragon's Dookie for sponsoring this episode. And that's it for this time. Thank you all so much for watching.